Welcome to edgeofcode.com's series of infinite roller tutorials. If you prefer a written tutorial, you can find one at edgeofcode.com. In a previous tutorial, we continued using blocks to create terrain. We made the menu buttons play the appropriate game and gave the different terrain types their own high scores. Today we're going to finish off by randomly generating the blocks as the character moves over them. So open your infinite roller project and the scene. Open the block and the block terrain generator scripts. And to start with, in block terrain generator, we're going to activate blocks in their initial random position. We're going to need to keep track of which blocks are active so that we know which ones are available to use next. So create a new variable, it can be private, and it's going to be a list of blocks again, but this one's going to be called active blocks. Then initialize this in awake. And now create a new method. Let's call it, it's going to be private void, and I'm going to call it activate blocks. We're going to need to pass in the number that we want to activate. Give it a comment. Okay, so in here we want to first create a for loop so that we activate this number of them. So each time through the loop we'll activate one. So do int I equals 0 to I equals num to activate, and increment by 1 each time through the loop. First we want to get a random inactive block. So create a new variable to store a block, and then we're going to create a new method called get random inactive block. So let's create that now. Be private, it needs to return a type block, and to start with, let's have a block to return. I'm going to call it next block. First we want to get a random number to use to select the block. So I'm going to use an int called random no, and that's going to be random.range between 0 and the number of blocks in the block list, which is blocks.count. And then let's get a random block. So in blocks we get the one at position random no. Next we want to make sure it's not active. So if the random block is not active, and I'm going to create this method in a moment. If it's active, then next block should be random block. If it's not, so if it is active, then we want to try again. So next block should equal get random inactive block again. So this is a recursive method. If the next block is active, then we go through this method again to try and find an inactive one. And we want to return next block. So let's create isBlock active in block. It needs to be public and a bool. And we just want to return if it's active or not. So that's GameObject.activeSelf. Go back to the block terrain generator and the ActiveBlocks method. And now that we have a block, we want to position it. So let's do that. Block. And again, we're going to create a method in block itself, in the block script, called set random position. And to do that, I'm going to pass in a variable front block. So remember, front block is the block at the front, and this block we want to position after that block, so we need to know where front block is. Let's go back to block and create that method. Front block is a block. Okay, so to position the block correctly, we need to know the width of front block, the width of this block, and add a bit of extra distance. Let's just have a look at that. So, so we have a load of blocks that we want to be at random positions. To be able to position a block, we need to know several distances. We need to know from the center of this one to the center of this one. Let's ignore that one for the moment. So we need to know the width of the block divided by 2, the width of this block divided by 2, and we have a random gap between them. So we need to know the width of each block. To do that, create a new property called block width with get and private set, because we don't need to set it outside this class. I'm using a property because this shouldn't appear in the inspector, but it needs to be public because we need to access front block's block width. So let's set this up in awake, create an awake method. To get the width of the block, we need to access the renderer. So use get component of type renderer. And then block width is renderer dot bounds dot size dot x. Now that we know the width, create a new local variable in set random position to store the distance between the current and the front block. So I'm going to call it block distance, and it's front block dot block width over 2 plus block width over 2. Next, we want to add an extra random distance between the blocks. So create another variable called random gap. I'm going to use random.range for this. And we'll create a couple of const variables called lower pos bound and upper pos bound and upper pos bound. They can both be private consts and floats. So I'm going to put the lower bound at 5 and the upper bound at 30. Also add another constant variable to limit the y position. So this one will be a float again, and I'm going to call it height range, and I'll start it with a value of 10. Now let's assign the x and y positions. So xpos is the x position of the front block plus block distance plus random gap. In case it's not obvious why we've got this bit, so then we add this block. We want to know we also need to know the distance the previous block is from the start position. So that's just what that is. For the y position, we'll use random.range and between positive and minus value of height range. And then set the new position. So transform.position equals new vector 3, x pos, y pos, and 0 for the z position. Save the script and go back to block terrain generator. So in activate blocks, since this is now the front block, we want to reassign front block to be this block. So front block equals block, and we want to activate it. So block dot set block active and pass in true, and then add it to the list of active blocks. So each time through the for loop we get a new block, we then position it and reset the front block to be that block, activate it and add it to the list. We want to call this method now from awake after we've instantiated the blocks. And I'm going to create another const variable to pass in here called num initial blocks. And let's use 5 for the moment. Make sure both scripts are saved and then check for errors. Blocks could not be found. Oh, block, not blocks. Okay, let's try again. Press play and blocks, and we have generated 5 initial blocks plus the initial block. So that's good. Next we need to generate blocks as the character is rolling along. So add an update method. So we want to keep track of where the player is. So let's say if player reached next position, and we'll create that in a moment. And if it does, we want to deactivate the first block. So we'll make a method to do that. And then we want to activate a new one ahead. And we can already do this using the activate blocks method that we made and passing in 1 to create one new block. So first, let's create deactivate first block. So private void deactivate first block. To do this, we want to get the first block, which is the active blocks list and the one at position 0, and then do first block and set it inactive, and remove it from the active blocks list. Rather than remove, because that takes an item, we want to use remove at, which lets you specify the index, which is 0 because we want the first one. So that will deactivate the first one, and we can create a new one afterwards. We just need to check what the position of the player is. The chunk terrain generator has a method that checks if the character has reached a certain position as well. So player reached next position should be an abstract method in abstract terrain generator. So copy that and open abstract terrain generator, and also open chunk terrain generator. In abstract terrain generator, create a public abstract bool method called player reached next position and save the script. In chunk terrain generator, find the matching method, and here it's called player reached next chunk. I'm going to rename that so that it's the same. So select it, right click, refactor and rename, and then I've pasted on player reached next position. This also needs to be an override method, since it now overrides the abstract one. Save that script and then go back to block terrain generator and create the override method in this one. So let's create a local bool variable called player reached next position with a lowercase p, and I'll set that to false to start with, and this will be what the method returns as well. If the player has reached a certain position, we'll set this to be true. In order to do this, we need a reference to the character, so go back up to the top and create a new public variable. We need the transform of the game object, so just use that. Go back to Unity and assign it. Oh, I've got an error. Chunk terrain generator can't be private. Okay, so I've forgotten to change this method to be a public one. Since it now overrides the abstract method, it has to be public. So save that, and I'll make sure that the other one's public as well. This is okay. Hopefully that's gone now. Go to block terrain generator and drag the character onto the slot. Back to the script. We want to find the distance between the player and the front block. So So let's create a variable called distance, and its front block and the x position of that minus the character's x position. And then if that distance is small enough, we want to activate the next block. So we want to set this to be true. So if distance is less than distance activate block, which we'll create in a second, then player reached the next position is true. Let's create this variable. I'm going to give it a value of 40 for the moment. You might need to change this value to get the blocks to generate correctly. Before we test it, we need to fill in the restart method. So in here we need to first deactivate all the blocks. To do that, we'll use a for each loop. So for each block in the blocks list, set it as inactive, and then we want to clear the active blocks list. And then reinitialize the front block to be the initial block. And add some new blocks by activating new ones using our activate blocks method. And we want to use the num initial blocks variable again. Okay, so save the script and go back to Unity, check for errors. There's none, then try and play the game and see if it's worked. So blocks should generate some blocks, and as the character rolls along we should see this one disappear in a moment and another one appear. So that's good. And it should just carry on until the character dies. Great. So save the scene and the project. So the game now generates either chunks or blocks depending on which button you press, and it will randomly generate them until the character dies. You've now learned how to create an infinite roller game. We've also learnt about random infinite terrain generation, audio, how to draw simple 2D objects, creating a UI system in Unity. Remember, you can download the files for this tutorial and all the previous ones on edgeofcode.com's download page. And I hope you've enjoyed these tutorials.